let's talk a bit about approach in animation. So this will be a more general video, since Jose studied this thread, and let's try to figure this out together. So this is a general discussion, and the question is, how do you approach animation, and how do you take everything into account? How to manage the details, how to manage the figure, the volume, the spacing, and there is no singular answer to this. So there's no clear singular solution. So let's walk over possibilities. So in terms of the motion, it's the easiest thing to track if you simplify the design as much as possible. So we're simplifying it and making scenes into primitives, like tracking the scenes that we used for the fire, like spheres or dots. But that's kind of a later thing on. So the first thing that we need to decide on is actually the principle for the motion, or rather the idea itself. And despite the fact that we usually work with a fill in this course, depending on the effect and depending on your experience and what you find comfortable, it might be better to use different tools. So for effects that are a bit more volumetric, I usually do line sketches and line drawings. And also, I do line thumbnails. So before doing the animation, we can do a couple rough thumbnails, trying to understand what it's gonna be. So for example, for the explosion animation, it might be good to have 3 or 4 thumbnails. Why 3 or 4? So the explosions usually consist of several parts. So there is an initial explosion or initial spark, kind of like the ignition. Then, second, there is the explosion itself. And third, there is dissipation. So how everything disappears. So this gives us idea of, okay, so what is the general motion, where everything goes, what is the direction of each part, and what do we want to add here, and how do we want to place scenes. So essentially we are doing the thumbnails to have a rough idea of how we want to put it on screen. So is it filling the entire screen? Is it filling only one area? Then what is the overall composition? So for example, here, it's like a triangle here, and this part of the triangle is going like this. And then we have a couple smaller elements. And then the later part is more of a circle, but slightly broken up. So having that, we have a general idea of the composition of the effect. And this is an important part. And since it's so loose, we can make things pretty quickly. We can make changes, we can simplify stuff, and this is a part of the syncing process. So what's important here? So ideally we want to stay loose and energetic, which is something that Lasso also allows, but not to that extent. So we don't talk about this much in the course, but there is a sense of flow that you can feel when you're drawing. So for example, I can draw a line and I can be very meticulous about it. So I can do something like this, going here. And you can see that while I'm drawing, it's kind of interrupted and there is no real flow in the lines that I draw. And I can still make something cool with that. The shapes can be still interesting. But in terms of the initial stages of the process, in terms of filling out the effect, this might not be the best scene to approach. So I usually plan and do scenes on the thumbnail process, trying to feel out the energy of the effect, and then clean things up that I don't need. And this leads to more accidents, more long flowing lines, and this helps me visualize the energy of the effect. So how things go, how things flow. It's literally like the flow of the lines on the screen. And it definitely requires getting used to, and you will still need the experience of analyzing effects and learning shape language to use it well, because this is just the line quality and the dynamic feeling of the effect that's being conveyed here. And if you don't have that shape library, of course it will still be hard to come up with something really interesting and really original and cohesive. But staying loose and searching for this form allows for experimentation and more interesting designs a lot of the time. So now that we have these three, we can start using them to actually make an animation. And at this point, we can go about it with the lasso tool, we can go about it with the line tool. It doesn't really matter. So we start with this frame here. And now we're okay, so the thumbnail was okay, but we can push the form, make this slightly more contrasting. We can push this shape a bit so that everything doesn't feel too similar. And here we can push it a bit more to the right. Here I think we can take away a symmetrical placement of this line. And maybe we can push some things here. So again, it's a starting point, but it's not the end design. And then we're searching for the form, finding interesting contrast in shapes and forms. Okay, let's say we have something like this. Then I'll draw our middle frame, the design for it at least. And again, the thumbnail is a starting point. It doesn't have to be exactly like this. We can push stuff, we can improve stuff. Okay, I don't like the bottom part. Maybe I can push this. Maybe we can push this part. And hopefully this shows that no one is free from the struggle. And actually it takes quite some time, even if you're an animator with some experience, to make the design pleasing and interesting. And I might zoom out to see it a bit better. Okay, let's say we have something like this. Then, as I showed here, we already have some negative shapes. And now we can also make them a bit more interesting. They're a bit repetitive, so let's break up the composition, maybe push the variation in them. And let's see. Let's have a stronger design here. Pushing the differences between these two, probably a good idea. So let's use this as a central compositional element. Okay. And let's put it somewhere over here so it doesn't overlap with our nodes. So let's say we have something like this. This is our second frame, and now we'll add a frame for the last part. Pushing the form a bit more. Never enough. Okay, we have this. Pushing this, making it smaller. This is bigger. Okay. Now we have the final frame where it settles down and dissipates. So we leave some of the stuff here. Maybe it rotates slightly. And we're establishing the shape language for this area. Maybe we have some stuff here that again dissipates, breaks up into particles. Maybe we introduce some holes and stuff to erase it. Maybe we emphasize the form by combining several particles, having a bit more variation in the sizes, and looking at the thumbnail as a base idea. And it's at this point that we define the rough idea for the motion. So where everything goes, what becomes which particle, how do we connect? So we're thinking in terms of directionality. So these holes are pushing like this. So they're probably going from this direction. Oh, these holes are similar. So at this point, we can easily change things and break it up or add stuff here and there. Maybe push it slightly to the left. Here. So here, a smaller particle. Again, keeping the variation in mind. Pushing the shapes. Leaving some smaller particles here. Maybe this area has a couple different shapes. Maybe it's slightly different. Maybe it's being erased more. Okay. So thicker, bigger particles, more race shapes, maybe some smaller stuff here and there. Okay, couple medium particles to spice things up, and a couple smaller ones here. Okay, so now we have this kind of stuff, and this is our rough idea for the animation. Now that we have this, we can start going and timing it out. So we can define the length of the animation, decide how long it should last. For example, I put this. This is a faster section. The start is faster. The middle section is slower. And the last section is the slowest part. So let's see how does this timing look. I mean, I think it looks okay. We can still experiment with it, but it looks fine. So now that we have this, we can actually start going and adding frames, or we can use this as a reference when we're animating stuff. And look at this and plan things out more carefully. So, okay, so we go and have this shape. I think we need one frame to transition from this shape to this shape. So one frame where we change the shape of this spark so that it pushes the masses towards the smoke shape. So one frame like this. Then I think we need at least a couple frames, maybe three, four frames to transition from this shape to this shape. And we have these holes pushing this mass. And we also emphasize that we have these holes. So they're probably pushing from this direction, this mass is being pushed like this mass being pushed like that. So we have the directions that we emphasized in the animation that we need to convey when we are doing actual motion. And essentially, these three frames that I did, they are broad keys that define the most important parts of the effect. They define the motion without adding too many frames. And then, essentially, the next keys that we add are breakdowns in between these frames describing transitions between keys. So I can put a frame here, then a frame somewhere over here, a frame somewhere over here. And we'll get something like this. We still have to think about the design, by the way, of the other frames. And again, these keys are also not locked in place. If something doesn't work well enough, we can change them by all means. We have to, because they only define the broad motion. And the broad motion might not work in some parts when we add more details and when we add more complexity. So, for example, here it's clear that this transition doesn't work. So the solution would be to change it up a bit. And then connect it. Okay. Okay, so we're seeing that the directions don't quite match. So maybe in this case we have to rotate it to match at least some of the parts. some of the bigger volumes. Okay, so we see that here, here, and here. Seems don't quite match, so we'll pick them up a bit. And let's see how that goes. Well, that works much better. Now we can do the same between these two frames, kind of figure out the rough transition. And with all this, again, it's not locked, it's not file animation. We're designing the motion, we're designing the transitions. And this is the part where we really think about the form, really think about the design. And the same is like for thumbnails, we're thinking about the composition and the overall general broad design. Here we are thinking about like the motion design and about more specific shape and form design. And if we want, after we get like a couple good frames, we can start thinking like we can take the frame or two and start thinking about the light and shadow. So not thinking about the motion for now, just a couple broad keys. We think about the placement of the shadows, where they should be placed. Where does it look good? Where does it have enough variation and enough contrast? And by taking away this pressure of having to think about everything in motion, it becomes a bit easier. And again, this is a rough guide. Since we'll change the motion, we can change some parts of the design. It won't be a final decision, but it will be the reference for us of how we want to approach things, how we want to structure it. And so let's do one frame. So the scene is being pushed out. We can define the direction of light. Let's say the light is hitting from top right. So the shadows would be on the left bottom. We are stretching some of the shadows out to make it feel more energetic and directional. This part can be more in shadow because it's more on the bottom. We can emphasize transitions between forms, vary the shapes. And this will be our guide for the most important frames in the animation in terms of how the smoke is lit. So this is the shadow. And we are going with something like this, for example. Okay. So now that we have this, we have a better idea of the shadow. And so on. So working like this allows us to plan things more and be more deliberate and controlled. Working with a lasso tool and without much planning is also a way to go. It just relies more on experimentation and studying. So the more you study, the more references you learn, the more sketches you do, the more designs you do, the easier it will be to do the same but with a fill, and essentially imagining all the shadows and all the other stuff in your head and trying things out. Now getting back here. So I think in terms of the motion, it's looking pretty good. So what I would do here is, again, I would first try to do something like this, to design the overall look, and you won't get it exactly, especially when you start animating, but this will be like a guide to you how to make scenes less even, how to make scenes more varied, how to keep scenes dynamic. And you can always fix it, you can always adjust it, but it's something that you can keep like at the edge of the screen, on the second screen, or print it somewhere, to help you understand, okay, so that's how I did it, and that's how I found out it works a bit better. In terms of light and shadow, I think it's really just studying the fundamentals, understanding that the smoke is essentially made up of a bunch of primitive shapes, simple shapes, like cones, spheres, and stuff, and they're not flat, they're three-dimensional. So for example, if it's a sphere, we can have like this lines running through the volume showing us the shape. And they are also not independent, rather each shape is combined and intersected with other shapes. So something like this, if we imagine it, or let me find another reference, or yeah, that's a good reference too, or something like this. So for example, here we'll observe three spheres being intersected, and if we look at it and break down the shapes, we'll actually get some of the classical small shapes. So let's see. So see, we get one sphere, and it's here. Then the second sphere intersects it. We get the third sphere intersecting it. And essentially, what we're getting is this classical smoke shapes. And if I stylize it a tiny bit, so one sphere, second sphere, add in some small stuff here, push in this sphere a bit, and maybe drawing a line like this here, gives us pretty standard smoke designs. Kind of imply some stuff instead of drawing it all out. And draws the intersection here. So that's how we get shapes like this. So this is one sphere intersected or combined with the other sphere. And then we add another sphere and something like this. And the key here is that the shapes are not fully separate. They're part of each other. They're being combined. So we don't have a full separation like this. And this is our surface, essentially. So going back here, so we probably won't have something like this, perfectly separated shapes. Rather, we'll have combinations of these shapes being part of the whole. And this is a big part of doing the effects. We're rather finding the unity and control, and we're finding order in chaos and balancing it out with structure. So for everything that's being chaotic and unpredictable, we're finding this perfect spot where it feels natural, but it's actually pretty structured and simplified. So we'll always try to simplify the shapes and combine them into groups rather than separated each shape continuously. And then the next layer is also a combination of the other layers reacting and grouping the stuff. So why does the scene look like this? So if you imagine a sphere, and if you imagine the light source is hitting from here, so what's happening is the light passes the sphere, and at some point the light hits the sphere perpendicularly, or rather it touches the edges of the sphere, and anything beyond that point is in shadow, and anything before that point is in the light. So this is a side view, and essentially the front view is where it touches. This is like the shadow area, and this is the illuminated area. What it will depend on is the position of the light source. So the position of the light source defines the direction of the shadow. So if it's hitting from here, so this is our direction. So the ellipse will be positioned like this along this axis, this line. How much of it, how much is covered, depends on how much to the into the canvas. So how far the light source is to the left, to the right, in the depths of the scene or towards us. So if we draw it like this, it means that the light source is hitting like more from the camera. And if it's hitting from the camera, we won't see a shadow. And if it's hitting from behind, so if the light source is hitting like this, so the shadow will be here. And so on. And so what this tells us is that the light source or the fire is wrapping around the surface of the sphere and defining this, essentially this edge, which is uneven and rounded because it's a sphere. And also you can see it touches the edges because it's a sphere. And since we have several spheres combined here, it follows the surface of both of them. So we'll probably get something like this and stuff. Or if we do it the other way around, it can be something like this. Which way does it face, or which way does it dissipate or disappear? Depends on the design. So in real explosions, the parts that face the air, the parts that hit the air, especially in bigger explosions. So when the smoke rises, the hotter parts of the smoke of particles, they go faster because they're lighter than air. And the colder ones, they go slower. So hot smoke goes up, cold air goes down. When the cold air hits the hot smoke or fire, it slowly cools down and becomes to move slower, and the hot smoke from the inside of the cloud starts to go faster, therefore pushing the now colder smoke and creating new shapes. This also means that usually in real explosions, the fire layer usually swirls and dissipates under the shape or inside the shape, and new layers of smoke get faster than it, which you see like in the second example that you shown. Here, since it's a pretty stylized explosion, it's a really small explosion. Now we can do different stuff and it really doesn't matter that much. It's just a design thing rather than being realistic and thinking about it a lot. So this is more technical perspective. From a design perspective, As long as we have variation and logic in the way that shapes move, it will work out. So we need variation between similar areas, between nearby areas, and then if the motion is good, if the design is good, it will probably work out okay. Next. So now let's look at this. And I think motion-wise, it's looking fine. We can push things. So right here, you see the transition here is not really clear. And we can be way more artistic about it. So right now the center just disappears. And we can push things a bit. Maybe leave some things here and start introducing like some negative shapes without breaking things completely, still leaving some areas connected to make sure that we get a nice sense of variation, because right now everything gets disconnected in one frame, and this makes it a bit less interesting since we don't have variation in timing for the breakup. We can also push the holes, so some can be small, some can be big. Push the variation here even more, make this more directional, maybe add some stuff to make the shape less symmetrical. All these things about the design, which are pretty hard to manage, and so on. And then when we break things up, again, we're losing a sense of contrast a bit, so I would break this big area into several particles rather than keeping it fully connected the entire time. And again, try to make them different enough. And this stuff is way easier planned like on a thumbnail with a couple sketches rather than trying to animate scenes perfectly right away, because scenes don't go that easily usually, especially when you're starting. So doing it perfectly right away would be very hard. And to test things out, I can do like pretty rough sketches. Something like, okay, so something explodes, and I'm trying to understand the energy. I'm trying to understand the overall direction. Okay, so something explodes. There's a bigger shape. We're adding a bit more mass. And doing like this, okay. So now designing what it becomes. Okay, it becomes something like this. Maybe. Huh. Okay, now I'll skip some frames, design how it breaks up. So maybe here it breaks up into particle like this, particle like that. Maybe here it breaks up into something else. Okay, so now I gotta think about the transition between these frames. Now let's look if it works. Let's time it out. Maybe 6 frames here, 6 frames here. Let's see. Okay, something is clearly off. So what can it be? Okay, let's see. So we go 1. Oh, it goes a lot to the right. And we have 2 similar shapes here. Let's fix that quickly. Oh, this is going not on the same path. Not problem. Okay. Putting this on the same path. Okay. Okay, now this is going off the path. Well, not a problem. Let's put this on the path. Put the particle in here. Okay. Now that's better. Now, I don't like the design, maybe. the overall composition can be pushed. Maybe we can really make it stylized. Maybe there are two shapes here and one shape at the bottom. And this shape stays directional for a bit. Okay, and now I gotta fix these particles. So working like loose and rough like this, and trying out ideas, trying what works better, may help you get less stuck on doing something perfectly right away. And then you can take these ideas, like take the best of the sketches, take the best of these ideas, and commit to it and actually do a more refined animation, more refined design frames, and push things further, make something really interesting and more finalized. So I hope this clarifies some stuff. I'll record the video doing the breakdown of the actual animation, and see you later.